Imagine a crisp April morning in 1945, the kind of day where the sun filters through budding trees and birdsong fills the air. But on the outskirts of a picturesque German town, something unimaginable is unfolding. Picture this: a procession of the nation's finest, doctors in tailored suits, professors clutching leather briefcases, elegant women in silk dresses and pearl necklaces, strolling down a winding path as if heading to a grand soiree. Laughter echoes faintly, conversations buzz about the latest symphony or a recent art exhibit. Yet this isn't a celebration. Shadowing them are battle-hardened American troops, rifles at the ready, faces etched with unspoken fury. These civilians aren't walking by choice. They're being herded like reluctant guests to a revelation that will shatter their world forever. What could force the cultured elite of a historic city to confront a hidden nightmare just miles from their manicured gardens? And why did one of history's toughest generals decide that ignorance was no longer an excuse? This is the untold chapter of how denial met its match, a forced awakening that exposed the thin veil between civilization and barbarity. Stick around, because what happened next didn't just change a town, it redefined accountability for generations. To grasp the weight of this moment, we must first step back into the heart of the place where it all converged. Weimar, Germany. This wasn't merely a dot on the map, it was the cradle of enlightenment, a beacon of intellectual and artistic grandeur. Nestled in the rolling hills of Thuringia, Weimar had long been synonymous with genius. It was here that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe penned his timeless works, where Friedrich Schiller's plays ignited philosophical debates. The city birthed the Weimar Republic, a fleeting era of democracy after World War I, and hosted the Bauhaus movement, revolutionizing design and architecture worldwide. Grand theaters hosted premieres of operas by Richard Wagner. Libraries overflowed with volumes on Kant and Hegel. The residents prided themselves on refinement, attending poetry readings, strolling through lush parks like the park in Der Ilm, where Goethe himself once wandered. They sipped coffee in cafes adorned with frescoes, debating ethics and aesthetics, convinced they embodied the apex of human progress. Yet this idyll masked a grim reality. Perched atop the Ettersberg Hill, a mere 5-mile jaunt along a scenic, tree-shaded road, loomed Buchenwald concentration camp. Established in July 1937, it began as a site for political prisoners but evolved into a sprawling machine of suffering, housing over 250,000 inmates from across Europe by war's end. What started with communists and dissidents soon engulfed Jews, Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The camp's name, meaning beech forest, belied its horrors, set amid the very woods that inspired German Romanticism. For 8 long years, Buchenwald operated in plain sight, or rather in willful blindness. SS officers and their families integrated seamlessly into Weimar society. Commandant Carlotto Koch and his infamous wife, Ilse, resided in a lavish villa on the camp grounds, complete with a private zoo stocked with exotic animals like bears and monkeys, funded by embezzled prisoner labor. Ilse, dubbed the Witch of Buchenwald, hosted tea parties for officers' wives, who shopped in Weimar's upscale boutiques for the latest fashions. SS personnel attended the same cultural events as the locals: concerts at the National Theater, exhibitions at the Goethe House. The camp's crematorium chimneys belched smoke day and night, visible from the city below. Ashes dusted rooftops and gardens. The acrid scent permeated the air on windy days. Rail cars laden with skeletal workers rumbled through town en route to forced labor sites like the nearby Gustloff Armaments Factory, where inmates toiled on V-2 rockets. Locals whispered excuses. The smoke was from bakeries or factories. The gaunt figures were foreign laborers volunteering for the war effort. "Wir haben nichts gewusst, we knew nothing," became the refrain, a collective mantra shielding comfortable lives from uncomfortable truths. But the facade crumbled on April 11, 1945, when elements of the U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, liberated Buchenwald. The SS had fled days earlier, abandoning the camp to its inmates, who formed an international committee to maintain order. Patton, a no-nonsense commander known for his audacious tactics in battles like the Bulge, arrived shortly after. He had already toured Ohrdruf, a sub-camp, where the sights left him reeling. Yet Buchenwald dwarfed it in scale. Sprawling across 1,000 acres, it held 21,000 survivors, emaciated men, women, and children from 30 nations, many reduced to 80 pounds or less, ravaged by starvation, disease, and experiments. Patton strode through the wrought iron gates bearing the cynical motto, Jedem das Seine, to each his own. He encountered barracks crammed with triple-decker bunks, where prisoners slept in filth, medical blocks where Dr. Edwin Katzenellenbogen conducted barbaric research on typhus vaccines, and the quarry where inmates hauled stones until they dropped. The general, a veteran of 2 world wars, confided to his diary, "It was the most horrible sight I have ever seen." His aide recalled Patton turning pale, stepping aside to compose himself. Gazing at the oblivious farmers tilling fields nearby, Patton's temper ignited. He demanded answers from local officials. Did the people of Weimar know? The denials poured forth, but Patton saw through them. This wasn't ignorance, it was complicity born of convenience. Determined to pierce the bubble, Patton issued an unprecedented directive. He summoned the military police and ordered a roundup not of criminals, but of Weimar's upper crust, 1,000 of the most prominent citizens, industrialists, academics, merchants, and their spouses. "Bring me the best dressed, the most educated," he barked. "Let them see what they've ignored." The MPs fanned out into the city, pounding on doors of opulent homes along Frauenterstrasse, interrupting luncheons and fine dining rooms. A banker protested his status. A university dean cited his schedule. Rifles silenced objections. Soon a surreal column formed. Men in fedoras and overcoats, women in heels and hats, marching under guard toward the hill. Jeeps patrolled the flanks, ensuring no stragglers. The mood started light. Murmurs of outrage mixed with bemused chatter, as if this were a misguided Allied prank. "My stockings will be ruined," one lady complained. Cameras captured their poised expressions, unaware of the transformation ahead. As the group ascended the Ettersberg, the atmosphere shifted. The spring breeze carried a foul odor, thick, nauseating, unmistakable. Conversations faltered, handkerchiefs emerged. The elite pressed on, prodded by soldiers until they reached the gates. What awaited inside would erase their smiles and etch eternal shame. But that's for the next chapter. How far would denial stretch when faced with undeniable proof? The gates of Buchenwald swung open, and the column of Weimar's elite stepped across the threshold into a world they had spent 8 years pretending did not exist. The iron sign above them, Jedem das Sein, to each his own, felt like a personal accusation now. No one laughed anymore. No one adjusted their hat or smoothed their coat. The playful complaints about dusty shoes had vanished the moment the smell became impossible to ignore. A thick, sweet-sour stench of decay that coated the tongue and lodged in the sinuses. Handkerchiefs were useless. Perfume-soaked scarves pressed to faces did nothing. The wind carried the odor straight into their lungs, and there was no escaping it. American soldiers formed 2 long lines, creating a narrow corridor that funneled the civilians forward. Rifles stayed low but ready. The order was clear: keep moving, keep looking, no turning away. At first the prisoners remained silent. Thousands of them stood behind the inner barbed wire, motionless, watching. Their striped uniforms hung like rags on bones. Many had no hair left. Typhus and malnutrition had taken it. Their eyes, hollow, unblinking, followed the procession of fur coats, polished shoes, and silk scarves. That stare carried no anger, no plea, only a quiet, exhausted recognition. It was the look of people who had long ago stopped expecting anything from the world outside the wire. The first stop was the roll call square. Here, every morning for years, inmates had stood for hours in snow, rain, or blazing heat while the SS counted them. Anyone who fell was beaten or shot. Now the square held something far worse than empty space. A long wooden trailer stood in the center, its flatbed piled high with corpses. Naked, skeletal bodies lay tangled together, arms and legs intertwined, mouths frozen open, eyes sunken or half closed. Skin stretched tight over ribs and hip bones had turned a sickly yellow-gray. Flies moved in slow clouds above the pile. The smell here was overpowering. Several women in the front row retched violently. One man, a prominent Weimar lawyer known for his eloquent speeches at cultural events, bent double and vomited onto the gravel. No one moved to help him. An American sergeant simply said, "Keep walking." Patton had insisted the civilians see everything in sequence, exactly as the liberators had found it. Next came the crematorium building. The doors were already open. Inside the air was hotter, heavier. 2 large brick ovens dominated the room. The metal doors stood ajar, black soot stained the brickwork. On the floor lay several bodies that had not yet been burned, too many corpses, too few workers left to operate the furnaces in the final weeks. Beside the ovens was a smaller room the SS had used as a dissection area. A long wooden table displayed what the camp doctors had collected. Shrunken heads of executed Polish prisoners sat upright in glass jars, preserved with chemicals. Sections of human skin bearing elaborate tattoos had been carefully cut and pinned flat like specimens in a natural history museum. Ilse Koch, the commandant's wife, had been particularly fond of these. She selected prisoners with interesting designs, anchors, flowers, ships, and ordered them killed so the skin could be tanned and turned into lampshades, book covers, or gloves for her private collection. A low murmur ran through the group. Some men wept openly now, shoulders shaking. A woman in a mink stole clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. An elderly professor who had once lectured on Goethe's concept of human dignity stared at the table without blinking, as though trying to convince himself the objects were not real. An American officer who spoke fluent German stepped forward. His voice was calm but cutting. These were made here. In your town's backyard. While you attended the theater. While you drank coffee on the terrace of the Elephant Hotel. While your children played in the park 5 miles away. No one answered. There was nothing left to say. The tour moved deeper into the camp. They passed the medical experimentation block where Dr. Sigmund Rascher and others had subjected prisoners to high-altitude tests, freezing experiments, and deliberate infection with typhus and malaria to test vaccines that were never intended to help the victims. Charts and photographs still hung on the walls. Neat graphs tracking body temperature drops, heart rates, survival times. The civilians were made to stand and read them. One young mother in the group, holding her teenage daughter's hand, began to sob uncontrollably. The daughter stared straight ahead, face blank, as though her mind had left her body. Further on they reached the little camp, the quarantine zone for the sickest prisoners. Typhus had raged here for months. The stench was so intense that even the American guards pulled bandanas over their faces. The civilians were given no such protection. They had to walk between the barracks, past open doorways where men lay on bare wooden planks, too weak to rise. Some reached out trembling hands, not for help but simply to show they were still alive. A former inmate, barely able to stand, shuffled toward a well-dressed banker from Weimar's Main Street. His voice was a dry rasp. I loaded coal at the station in 1942. You walked past me every morning in your gray suit. You never looked at my face. Not once. The banker dropped to his knees in the mud. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear I didn't know. The prisoner only stared, then turned away. By the time the group reached the final exhibit, the storage room filled with thousands of pairs of shoes, eyeglasses, suitcases, and prosthetic limbs taken from new arrivals, the silence was absolute. No more protests. No more excuses. The carefully constructed world of Weimar's cultural aristocracy had cracked open, and what poured out was shame so deep it left them physically smaller. Shoulders slumped. Heads bowed. Makeup ran in black streaks down powdered cheeks. Expensive overcoats were streaked with dust and vomit. When they finally passed back through the main gate, the spring sun still shone. Birds still sang in the beech trees. But nothing looked the same. The hill that had once promised pleasant walks now loomed like a gravestone. The civilians walked down in complete silence. No one spoke. No one met anyone else's eyes. The jeeps still flanked them, but the soldiers no longer needed to shout. The lesson had been delivered. What they carried back to Weimar was heavier than any suitcase. The knowledge that beauty and barbarity had lived side by side, separated only by 5 miles, and a deliberate refusal to look. And that refusal had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The story isn't over yet. In the days that followed, the silence in Weimar grew louder than any scream. Some could not bear the weight of what they had seen. Others tried to rebuild the wall of denial, brick by brick. But the cracks were permanent. And soon the world beyond Germany would be forced to confront the same truth, because Patton's decision triggered something much larger than one town's awakening. The walk back down the Ettersberg Hill was nothing like the walk up. On the ascent, the column of Weimar's privileged had still carried fragments of their old world, snatches of conversation, the occasional nervous laugh, the faint rustle of silk and wool. Now there was only the crunch of shoes on gravel and the soft, uneven breathing of people who had just seen something they could never unsee. No one spoke. No one looked at the beech trees lining the path or commented on the spring light filtering through the leaves. The jeeps rolled slowly beside them, engines low, but the soldiers no longer needed to prod or shout. The civilians moved like sleepwalkers, heads down, eyes fixed on the ground a few feet ahead. When they reached the city limits, the column began to dissolve. People peeled off toward their own streets without farewell, without eye contact. A woman in a once pristine hat clutched her husband's arms so tightly her fingers left marks through the fabric. A professor who had spent decades teaching the ideals of humanism walked alone, coat unbuttoned, tie loosened, staring at nothing. The MPs watched them go, rifles still slung, faces unreadable. They had delivered General Patton's message. What happened next was up to Weimar itself. That evening the city felt different. Windows that usually glowed warmly stayed dark earlier than usual. Conversations in living rooms were hushed, if they happened at all. Many of the people who had been on the hill simply sat in silence, still wearing the same clothes they had marched in, dust-streaked suits, scuffed heels, tear-streaked makeup that no one bothered to repair. Some tried to speak about ordinary things: dinner, tomorrow's weather, a neighbor's new baby. The words felt obscene. How could anyone mention roast chicken or a child's first steps after seeing that trailer of bodies? After smelling the little camp? After looking at preserved human skin laid out like museum pieces? In the days that followed, the first visible signs of fracture appeared. Several of the most prominent citizens who had been forced to walk the camp did not leave their homes again. One industrialist, owner of a respected porcelain factory that had supplied fine tableware to half of Thuringia, was found hanging in his study 2 nights later. A well-known physician who had once delivered lectures on medical ethics at the university took an overdose of barbiturates. A lawyer famous for his courtroom eloquence left a single note on his desk: "I saw. I knew. I said nothing." The local newspapers, still operating under American military oversight, did not print obituaries with the usual flowery language. They printed the bare facts, and the city read between the lines. Patton heard the reports of the suicides. According to those who were in the room, he listened without expression, then said only, "Good. Maybe the rest will think twice before they look away again." He did not gloat. He did not mourn. To him, the deaths were simply evidence that the tour had reached its target, not just the eyes but the conscience. Word of what had happened in Weimar spread quickly. American correspondents attached to the Third Army filed stories that carried photographs no newspaper had dared print before: the piled bodies, the ovens, the shrunken heads in jars. The images crossed the Atlantic and reached London, Paris, Moscow. In Washington, President Truman was briefed. In London, Churchill read the dispatches. Both leaders understood the danger of what lay ahead. The war was ending, but a different kind of battle was beginning, one over memory itself. Already, in some corners of Germany and beyond, people were whispering that the camps were exaggerated, that the photographs were staged, that the whole thing was Allied propaganda designed to humiliate a defeated nation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had seen Ohrdruf and Buchenwald for himself. The smell, the bodies, the survivors who looked like living skeletons. He knew no one who had not witnessed it could fully comprehend it. He also knew human nature. He knew that time and distance would soften horror into abstraction, that future generations might dismiss the evidence as atrocity propaganda, just as some had dismissed early reports of the Armenian genocide 25 years earlier. So Eisenhower did something extraordinary. He expanded Patton's initiative on a massive scale. He sent urgent cables to Washington and London: bring the press, bring the politicians, bring the skeptics. He wanted members of Congress, British members of Parliament, editors of major newspapers, leaders of religious organizations, anyone who might one day be in a position to shape public memory. He wanted them to see with their own eyes so that if denial ever rose again, there would be credible, first-hand witnesses who could stand up and say, "I was there. I smelled it. I touched the gate. I saw the children who weighed less than my dog." Within days, delegations began arriving. Senators and congressmen walked the same path the Weimar citizens had walked. British MPs stood in the crematorium courtyard, faces gray. Newspaper editors who had spent years writing measured editorials now struggled to find words at all. One American senator, after seeing the pathology room, turned to an army officer and said quietly, "If I live to be 100, I will never forget this." He kept that promise. Decades later, when Holocaust denial began to appear in French publications, that same senator, now elderly, gave interviews repeating the same sentence: "I was there. It happened." Eisenhower himself wrote to General George Marshall, "The things I saw beggar description. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Those words became one of the most quoted passages in Holocaust documentation. They were not emotional. They were strategic. Eisenhower understood that truth is not self-evident. It must be protected by witnesses. Back in Weimar, the town tried to return to normal. Shops reopened. Concerts resumed in the National Theater. But the hill was always there. Every clear day, residents could look up and see the outline of the camp against the sky. Every time the wind blew from the west, a faint trace of that old smell returned, not strong enough to make people gag anymore but enough to remind them. The city that had once called itself the cradle of German culture now carried a second, unspoken name: neighbor to hell. Yet even then not everyone accepted the lesson. Some rebuilt the wall of denial brick by careful brick. They told themselves the Americans had exaggerated. They told themselves the worst crimes were committed by a small group of fanatics far away. They told themselves that looking away had been the only way to survive. And in quiet conversations behind closed doors, a few even began to resent the forced tour itself. Resent the humiliation, resent the shame, resent the foreigners who had made them look. That resentment would grow in the years to come. But in April 1945, in the immediate aftermath, the silence was deafening. And that silence was the first real admission of guilt. The story still has one final layer. Because what Patton began in Weimar did not end when the last civilian walked back down the hill. It set in motion a reckoning that reached far beyond one town, one camp, one spring week in 1945. It became part of the legal and moral foundation for the trials that followed, and for the way the world still tries, imperfectly, to remember. The reckoning that began on that April morning in 1945 did not end when the last civilian disappeared into the streets of Weimar. What Patton started as a single brutal act of forced confrontation quickly became a blueprint, one that Allied commanders, prosecutors, and eventually the entire post-war world would draw upon to confront an uncomfortable truth. Atrocity thrives when ordinary people choose comfortable blindness. In the weeks following the tour, American psychological warfare teams moved through Thuringia with mobile film units. They screened raw, unedited footage of Buchenwald, taken by Army Signal Corps cameramen the day of liberation, inside makeshift theaters set up in town squares, factories, and even churches. No music, no narration, just the sound of the wind, the creak of barracks doors, the low moans of survivors, and the dull thud of bodies being moved. Civilians were not forced to attend these screenings, but word spread quickly. Attendance was high. People came out of curiosity, out of fear of seeming uncooperative, out of a desperate need to understand what they had already half admitted to themselves. Many left before the film ended. Some stayed until the final frame and then walked home in the same stunned silence that had followed the Hill March. Eisenhower's decision to bring international delegations proved even more far-reaching. By late April and into May 1945, planeloads of visitors arrived almost daily. A group of 21 U.S. congressmen, including future President Lyndon Johnson, walked through the crematorium and stood before the same trailer of bodies the Weimar elite had seen. British parliamentarians, French resistance leaders, Soviet officers, newspaper editors from the New York Times, the Manchester Guardian, Le Monde, all of them were guided along the same route. Many wrote about it immediately. Some could not write at all for days. One British MP, after returning to London, told the House of Commons, "I have seen hell on earth, and it was built 5 miles from a city that prided itself on producing Goethe." The sentence was quoted across the English-speaking world. These first-hand accounts mattered enormously in the months that followed. When the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg opened in November 1945, the prosecution did not rely solely on documents or captured Nazi records. They called living witnesses, survivors, liberators, and some of the very civilians who had been marched up the hill. A former Buchenwald inmate, now barely recovered, testified about the daily roll calls, the medical experiments, the selections for the gas chambers at Auschwitz that began with trains leaving from Weimar station. When defense lawyers suggested exaggeration, the prosecution played film footage in the courtroom. The defendants, men who had once controlled ministries and armies, looked away or stared at the floor. Hermann Göring, who had laughed off earlier atrocity reports, sat motionless as the images flickered across the screen. The Weimar tour became a quiet but powerful piece of evidence in those proceedings. Several defendants had personal or professional ties to Thuringia. They had visited Weimar, dined in its restaurants, attended its cultural events. The fact that a concentration camp of Buchenwald size had operated for 8 years within sight of such a cultured city undermined their claim that the worst crimes were isolated acts by low-ranking fanatics. It showed the system had required the acquiescence, if not the active participation, of a much wider circle. Beyond the courtroom, the forced confrontation shaped the way the Allies approached denazification. In the American zone, military governors adopted a policy of mandatory re-education visits for certain categories of Germans. Teachers, journalists, civil servants, clergy, anyone who had held influence over public opinion. The visits were not as theatrical as Patton's original march. No fur coats, no jeeps, no rifles, but the message was the same. see it, smell it, remember it. In some towns, local mayors were required to accompany school classes to former camps. The intention was not punishment but prevention. If the next generation grew up knowing exactly what silence had allowed, perhaps the chain could be broken. Yet the most profound legacy was invisible. It lived in private moments. A Weimar schoolteacher who had once marched up the hill began, without fanfare, to teach her students about Buchenwald, not the sanitized version but the real one. She showed them photographs she had secretly kept. She told them the smell never entirely left her clothes. A former banker who had collapsed in the little camp started quietly funding relief efforts for survivors. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen, but every month a check arrived at a displaced persons center in Munich. Small acts, rarely recorded, but multiplied across thousands of people who had once said, "We didn't know." Of course, not everyone changed. Some hardened their denial. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, pamphlets began circulating in West Germany claiming the camps had been work facilities, that the death tolls were inflated, that photographs had been doctored. These voices remained marginal for a long time, drowned out by the sheer volume of eyewitness testimony. But they never disappeared completely. Each time they resurfaced, in courtrooms, in fringe publications, later on internet forums, the same counter-evidence was brought forward. The films, the congressional reports, the letters Eisenhower wrote, the suicide notes left on desks in Weimar villas. Patton himself did not live to see the full arc of what he had set in motion. He died in December 1945 after a car accident in Mannheim. But before he left Germany, he told his staff something that stayed with them. "We didn't do this for revenge. We did it so the next time someone says, 'I didn't know,' they'll have to look in the mirror and know they're lying." The parade of shame on April 16, 1945, was only one moment among millions of horrors. Yet it stands apart because it forced a confrontation not with strangers but with neighbors. It showed that evil does not always arrive wearing a monster's face. Sometimes it arrives wearing a tailored suit, carrying a briefcase, humming a tune from Beethoven as it walks past a train platform where skeletal men are unloading coal. That single day did not erase what had happened. It did not bring back the dead. But it did something almost as difficult. It made looking away much harder. There is one final part to this story, the part that brings us back to the present, to the questions we still ask ourselves when governments commit crimes in our name, when neighbors disappear, when smoke rises somewhere just beyond the horizon. That comes next. The final layer of this story is not locked in 1945. It lives in every decade since, every time someone asks, "How could people let this happen?" and every time the same four words resurface, "We didn't know." After the tours, the films, the Nuremberg trials, and the slow, painful denazification process, the world believed, mostly, that the lesson had been learned. Buchenwald's gates became a memorial in 1950 under East German administration, then a full national memorial site after reunification. The crematorium ovens still stand. The roll call square is silent. The beech trees that once framed the camp now shade paths where school groups walk in quiet lines, listening to guides explain what happened. Tourists from every continent take photographs of the iron gate with its mocking inscription. They read the names on the memorial plaques. They leave flowers, small stones, handwritten notes. Most leave shaken. A few leave angry, not at the past but at the present. Because the excuse "we didn't know" never really died. It simply changed clothes. In the 1950s and 1960s it appeared in courtroom testimonies from low-level functionaries who claimed they were just following orders, or only did clerical work. In the 1970s and 1980s it echoed in revisionist books and pamphlets that called gas chambers delousing facilities, and death marches evacuations. By the 1990s and 2000s it migrated online. First in obscure forums, then on social media platforms, then in polished videos with calm narrators and dramatic music. The arguments are familiar. Numbers exaggerated, photographs staged, survivors unreliable, Allied propaganda designed to justify the firebombing of Dresden or the division of Germany. Each time the same body of evidence is wheeled out again, the Eisenhower cables, the congressional reports, the Signal Corps footage, the testimonies of the men and women who walked up that hill in April 1945 wearing their best clothes and came down changed forever. Yet the most dangerous version of "we didn't know" is not the outright denial shouted in comment sections. It is the softer, more respectable version whispered in living rooms and boardrooms and classrooms. "We couldn't have known, it was complicated, most people were just trying to survive, you can't judge the past by today's standards." These are not lies in the strict sense. They are half-truths polished until they shine. They let us feel sympathy for the silent majority without ever having to confront the cost of that silence. Weimar's elite were not cartoon villains. They were not all fanatical ideologues. Many were genuinely cultured. They loved music, literature, philosophy. They raised children, paid taxes, donated to charities, attended church or synagogue before 1933. They were, in the most ordinary sense of the word, civilized. And still, a factory of death operated 5 miles from their front doors for 8 years. The smoke drifted over their rooftops. The trains rattled through their station. Their local economy benefited from slave labor. And they chose, day after day, year after year, to arrange their mental furniture so the view was never obstructed. That is the part that stings most when we look back. Not the monsters in black uniforms, but the ordinary, educated, polite people who lived beside the monsters and decided the neighborly thing was to keep the curtains drawn. So the question that has followed the Weimar March for 80 years is not really, did they know? We have mountains of evidence that say yes, at the very least they knew enough to suspect, and suspicion is a form of knowledge. The real question is quieter and more uncomfortable. What would we do in their place? Today information moves faster than ever. Satellite images appear on phones within hours of atrocities. Videos are uploaded in real time. Reports are published, leaked, debated, fact-checked and redebated before breakfast. And yet the same patterns repeat. People scroll past images of suffering because the algorithm has already moved on to something lighter. They say, it's not my country, it's too far away, both sides are bad, I don't have the full picture. They change the subject to something safer. They stay silent when speaking would cost them likes, followers, promotions, invitations, peace of mind. Silence still has a very high approval rating. Patton's decision on that spring day in 1945 was not elegant. It was not gentle. It was not even strictly legal by today's standards. But it was brutally honest. He refused to let "we didn't know" stand as an alibi. He dragged the alibi into the daylight and made it look at itself in the mirror. And for one afternoon at least, the alibi cracked. The hill is still there. The gate is still there. The ovens are still there. Survivors are fewer every year, but the physical evidence remains. So do the photographs, the films, the letters, the suicide notes, the congressional reports, the Nuremberg transcripts. The record is not perfect, but it is overwhelming. If there is any inheritance from that forced parade of shame, it is this. Looking away is a choice. Knowing enough to suspect is already knowing. And once you have seen, truly seen, there is no unseeing. The citizens of Weimar walked back down the hill on April 16, 1945, carrying something heavier than guilt. They carried certainty. They knew. They could never again say they didn't. That certainty did not make them saints. It did not erase what had already happened. But it did close one door forever, the door marked plausible deniability. 80 years later, that door is still closed for anyone willing to walk up their own version of the hill and look. The rest is up to us. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what knowing really means in a world full of screens and distance, leave a comment below. Tell me, when have you seen something uncomfortable and chosen to look away? When have you forced yourself to keep looking? And if you want more stories that dig into the hard human side of history, stories that don't let us hide behind easy answers, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next time we'll go inside another camp, another liberation, another moment when the truth refused to stay buried. Thank you for staying until the end.